support, certainly to me and to the officers, in moving so swiftly over the last 3 weeks and virtually making this meeting happen. When, you know, as we all know, the original act that gave far-reaching powers to the police force omitted to give police and crime panels the legal ability to meet. The swiftness of the panel in registering this, both with the LGA and subsequently the Home Office, saw new regulations published within 10 days that made it legal for us to meet and have this meeting today. I'd also like to thank the members as well for canvassing people within their wards and putting together such comprehensive questions as we have in front of us today. They are very concise questions which were pre-submitted to the Commissioner out of fairness, and we exercised extreme brevity in the questions. And I know the Commissioner, because there is such a comprehensive list, also wants to do the same in responding to them today. I would say we're all on a massive learning curve with this telephone conferencing. I've done numerous ones over the last couple of weeks, and you know, you're learning as you go, so please don't be embarrassed. Everyone's on a learning curve. Let's all relax, take our time, and we'll get through it. One final thing, I would like to thank the officers of Cheshire East and the authority for getting us to this point with the technology and everything else. And I've said it on many occasions, I don't want to over-egg it. Councillor Dawson, for his guidance, one-to-one tuition with members has been absolutely fantastic. I think whatever political party you come from, we always put that one side. We pride ourselves by being apolitical, and we have a serious job to do. And as I've stated before, our position is one of the policing family. It was very pleasing that very early on during this phase, I spoke with the Commissioner and his Chief of Staff, and they said they need scrutiny now more than ever. And we want to work as part of that family to reassure the public of Cheshire that we are there as we're mandated to by law to oversee this. Now, I think at this stage, Andrew, if you haven't done it already, I suspect you have, the journalists and members of the public who are in on this meeting should be muted.
They are.
Thank you. Moving around my screen, as I see it, I will go to, I won't say Martin, I'll say Councillor Delaney. Could you take the first question, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Question 3. Good morning, Commissioner. Can you explain to members of the panel how Cheshire Police are implementing the strategy of engage, explain, encourage, enforce?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Delaney. Thank you, Chairman. I was going to have an introductory statement, but I do recognise time limitations, which mean we should crack on. If I can say that from speaking to the Chief Constable, it's clear that the Constabulary have implemented the national suggested approach, which panel members will rightly understand is very much in keeping with Cheshire's style of community policing. The focus in all constabulary briefings and communications has been on the first 3 of the 4 E's, with enforcement only as a very last resort and only to be used where necessary and proportionate. I'd say in the main, the response we've had back in the public of Cheshire has been overwhelmingly positive, and they've welcomed the style and approach and helpfulness of officers. This is being monitored through incidents reported, through the single online home system, through social media, through emails, and face-to-face feedback. So I'm very content so far that the strategy of engaging with the public, explaining those regulations, encouraging people to comply with those regulations before considering enforcement action is the right way to deal with this. And I am satisfied, as we'll come on to, I think, in later questions, to give the assurance that this is working with a style which we all support and respect of policing by consent.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Martin, any further questions on that issue?
Just an observation, Chairman. In personal observation, this does appear to be the what I've seen playing out in Chester, in Cheshire. That's all.
Thank you for that, Commissioner, and the brevity. It's most welcome. Commissioner, a question for myself, and I'll take the question one. We understand the Coronavirus Act 2020 gives the police the ability to arrest someone with COVID-19 who refuses to self-isolate. Can you confirm the constabulary developed some form of standard operating procedure in such circumstances, and outline to us the level of PPE that would be used in the event of such action being taken?
Yes, thank you, Evan. I've had some final clarification with the Chief Constable this morning, which does confirm that the most recent Act doesn't give the power of arrest to those that refuse to self-isolate, and legal advice that this is a summary-only offence. If I can explain that a little bit more, the legislation does suggest that if a police officer has reasonable grounds to suspect a person is potentially infectious with COVID-19, the officer may do two things. They may direct that person immediately to a particular place for screening and assessment, i.e. testing, or secondly, they can remove that person to a testing place. What officers are not able to do under this particular legislation is to make arrests to take to a custody facility. That should reinforce that the other general powers of arrest do remain appropriate and usable. Those reasonable grounds that we mentioned to suppose that someone is potentially infected in Cheshire, the direction is that they should only be carried out under the direction of a public health officer. In terms of the standard operating procedure, officers have been fully briefed and provided guidance, which is national guidance, which offers a range of scenarios and advice, highlighting appropriate PPE for each scenario. Members will be pleased to know that Cheshire has a special operations response team, which has a full range of PPE and specialist knowledge regarding its particular use. Just with the assurance that officers of this special response team would provide that primary response where specific risks are evident.
Okay. Have we included in that at all the use of, because I've had reports of police officers being spat at in their face by people who are saying they've had COVID-19. The use of spit hoods in sort of risk reduction around that area, is that one of the scenarios that you see?
Thank you, Chairman. I can suggest, I have discussed this early on with the Chief Constable, because you're quite right. The coronavirus has been used, unfortunately, as a threat by a tiny minority of the public towards both essential workers of all natures, including policing. I think once an arrest had took place, those would be used, but what we're talking about here is probably primarily in those early stages of engagement and explanation. If these issues, the temperature raises very quickly, there may well not be the opportunity to use spit hoods, which would very often take place following arrest. Much of these scenarios are pre-arrest scenarios of which we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Right, I'm reassured by that. I'm reassured by the response team, and the PPE is available in, you know, circumstances which we'd rather not be faced with. Thank you for that. Councillor, thank you. Councillor Thompson, can you take the next question, please?
Chairman, I'm going to go to question 11, which is in a similar vein to question 3 that Councillor Delaney inquired about. The question is, what checks and balances are in place to prevent overzealous police behaviour? And I think for the Commissioner, the emphasis there is on what checks and balances. We of course have seen reports about forces who have used drones, who have been looking through shopping bags, and I think it's very important for people out there in Cheshire to really understand that there is absolute consistency between officers in Cheshire, but also consistency between officers in Cheshire and other forces. I, for example, live in Cheshire, but I work in Merseyside, and there should be consistency across forces. So I was just wondering whether the Commissioner could give some reassurances about the checks and balances so that we have a consistent approach.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Chairman. I think Councillor Thompson raises some very valid points which must have proportionality, must be consistency, particularly in a time when government legislation has put such extensive measures that limit people's freedoms. I would say the measures that we have to enforce those are quite limited, although the limitations that are put on people are quite extensive. And I would say that in the early stage of guidance being released from government, even before it came on the statute books, I think there's been varied interpretations both by the public and by police forces up and down the land. What I would say is I think that most police forces apply these in the spirit of the regulation and with the right, generally with the right intentions, but I would respect those cases that have been pointed out that would point to inconsistencies. Within Cheshire, I'd say there are generally 3 areas of these checks and balances on what's been called overzealous police behaviour. The first one, I suppose, are kind of internal messages from the chief officer team, that there is a clear direction around engagement with the public to seek their cooperation to ensure that guidelines are observed to keep people safe and well. As I mentioned earlier, any enforcement activity is viewed as a very last resort, and as discussed, there is an internal team for this whole project that we call the Operation Pandas team in Cheshire that leads the operational response, and that team actually reviews all enforcement activity. So every part of the enforcement of these rules are reviewed by one team to ensure that it aligns with this proportionate approach which Cheshire aims to take. The second area of this would be the police complaint system, which remains completely operational and accessible to the Cheshire, and this provides the opportunity for the public to express concerns or, as members know in the new system, any expression of dissatisfaction if they feel it necessary to do so. That system that continues, as members know, is a statutory system, and it ensures even expressions of dissatisfaction are reviewed and handled within that regulatory process. The third point that I point to in terms of reassurance is my weekly sessions directly with the Chief Constable do have a review of the past week the work of that Operation Pandas team to review the nature of enforcement, and our regular scrutiny sessions analyse and scrutinise patterns in complaints that may be formed. So I hope that gives the council some reassurance, and I do know that we turn to this issue in some different depth in other questions put to by the panel today.
Thank you, Commissioner. David, any supplementary to that? Anything?
No, I mean, there's a big learning curve here for everybody, for the public, and of course for police forces as well. But purely out of interest, and because I haven't seen the statistics, and it perhaps gives some indication of how things are going, could the Commissioner give some idea as to what the figures are in Cheshire in terms of where the forces needed to actually take enforcement? Have there been arrests? Has there been how many penalty notices have been issued? What currently is the scale of that, so I can kind of gauge how things are going?
Yeah, it's a really good supplementary question, Councillor, and this really gives the perspective, I suppose, of proportionality. I'll give you those figures on the basis of speaking to the Chief Constable earlier this week. Obviously, we recognise we have a population of over 1 million people in Cheshire. Out of those, as I said before, there have been no arrests because that's not provided for in this legislation, but there have been wider arrests on other offences. In terms of the actual amount of fines or fixed penalty notices issued, that's a number of 45. So 45 issued. That is out of as I say, of a population of over 1 million residents in Cheshire.
Chairman, can I just say that's reassuring? I think out there, there are probably forces who are doing that in one day. So that's very reassuring to know that there's not heavy hand. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Commissioner. And just to emphasise from the start, we've heard reports of this behaviour from various parts of the country, but by and large, my experience also is that Cheshire Police and the Special Constabulary are doing a superb job, because the streets are empty and people's behaviour generally is exemplary in my view. Okay, thanks for that. We're moving through this business very nicely. Could I go to Councillor Judah, please? And if you could give the number of the question, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask question number 5. Good afternoon, Commissioner. Nationally, we've seen a huge rise in the rate of reported domestic abuse since the implementation of the Coronavirus Act 2020. Is this reflected in Cheshire?
Thank you, Councillor Judah. I think you raise an essential issue on a huge priority of yours and mine and the panel's. I'd agree that nationally and internationally, experts, charities, international media have suggested very clearly that isolation measures have increased the risk as well as the actual number, the severity and perhaps the regularity of abuse experienced by some of the most vulnerable in our communities. Domestic abuse charity helplines are recording higher volumes of those needing support of around 25%. I've been on a call that I brought together this morning for an hour or so before this meeting with leaders from the domestic abuse sector in Cheshire that now takes place fortnightly. And I would say that until my last call, that the recorded volume of domestic abuse within Cheshire had not actually increased. We considered this about 2 weeks ago because we were very worried actually about the reasons for that not increasing as it had in other places. On face value, you could clearly take that as as a good sign, but in this area, once we look into the reality, we can see that underreporting is actually a really, really big risk. So following a discussion with practitioners from the Cheshire domestic abuse sector, we considered this a couple of weeks ago and saw the real problem that isolation brings for those affected by domestic abuse, and that real issue of how do you seek help when perhaps you're stuck at home with the perpetrator. So over the past couple of weeks, we've developed jointly a scheme focusing on the Open the Door campaign, which is supported by local authorities and policing and the voluntary sector throughout Cheshire. Through that, we put up things like posters in supermarkets and other places, particularly where people can visit when they're on their own. And we've also sent out and delivered messages to staff in these arenas to encourage their understanding. This seems to have worked well, and on the call this morning, I have heard that reports within Cheshire now have increased by 3% over this period. So I think that element of making sure the services are there, making sure that they're accessible, and making sure that they're accessible in a way that takes into account the current situation of people being isolated with abusers is absolutely essential. And I'd applaud the part that Cheshire Police have played in that, from the PCSOs delivering these posters to the Chief Constable's ability to write a joint letter to me to all shops and supermarkets and other facilities, to their staff taking that on board and being aware to listen to the messages and give some basic signposting, to the wonderful practitioners on the front line in Cheshire that are there to support those that suffer from a domestic abuse. So a really strong message there in response to a quite frightening situation, Councillor Judah.
Okay, thank you. Any supplementary, Councillor Judah?
Yes, you talked about the poster and the open the door policy. Can you just be a bit more explicit about the poster? Does it advertise the golden hour where people can go to a police station for an hour every day? That's the national rollout, isn't it? Is that what you're doing? Is that what you're doing in Cheshire East?
There is certainly a couple of campaigns. There's been a national campaign from government that has responded to calls from commissioners by the ministers on our weekly calls to give more support to domestic abuse. I'm currently still speaking to ministers about that and had a call yesterday. My current criticism is that the funding they're provided is nothing more essentially than a marketing campaign nationally. I'm very much more supportive of our local multi-agency campaigns, such as Open the Door Cheshire, which is already there. It's already well known, well provided. It's not just a reporting line, although it does include that. It's actually a line as granular as on the local authority basis of where you can report, how you can report, what support's available, who offers that, how this all comes together in unison and wraps around people to keep them safe. So whilst I am broadly supportive of the national schemes, I do believe that Cheshire, with its coordinated partnership approach, actually does much more than signposts. It actually really helps people out in perhaps their greatest time of need.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are you satisfied with that, Councillor Judah?
Yeah, I'd like to know probably later on what measures are in place to engage and control with known perpetrators of domestic abuse, but maybe that's for later.
We'll come back to that one as we move through. I'm just conscious of time, but I think I would like to add, as you know, Commissioner, domestic abuse services are tragically underfunded, and given this current situation, the panel would support any steps to lobby and bring a focus to this. Moving business on, and thank you to everyone for keeping it nice and tight and crisp. Could I go to Councillor Dawson, and could you give me the number of the question, please, Councillor Dawson?
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioner. I'd like to join together questions 10 and 19 and really give you the opportunity to tell us all about how Cheshire Police has been affected by the corona outbreak in terms of how its business has changed, how resilient the police force is, how is it coping with its own sickness absence, how is it coping with the change in business, as it were, because obviously policing the community at the moment is very different from policing the community before. And then if you could then touch on the budgetary implications for you in terms of where you think you now stand, because clearly all your original budgetary calculations might very well have been affected by what's gone on.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Dawson, and good afternoon to you. I think the kind of combining of those two questions is a good idea. On an overall level, my reflection would be that a large amount of policing in Cheshire remains on the same basis as it did prior to the crisis, and I think that replicates the view of how well we are developed in terms of mutual relationships with our communities, with our local authorities, with the style of community policing. Something that residents are very used to having is that well-known local name-faced officers and PCSOs in their communities. So I think we're already ahead of the game with this by the nature of what we've been able to deliver over the past couple of years in maintaining that really close community policing presence. I'm really keen that that's happened, and that's happened very well. Obviously, as you say, that there are some real changes in other factors. You'll be aware generally that crime has dropped in Cheshire over this period for perhaps some of the obvious reasons of people being isolated and more regular checks taking place when people are out and about. In terms of resilience, continuity planning and testing, etc., you will be pleased to know that the Constabulary immediately implemented a structure to manage the required operational response to COVID-19. Members will be aware of some of the language in terms of the gold, silver, bronze command structure. Gold meetings, those top level meetings, are taking place twice weekly, chaired by the Assistant Chief Constable Jenny Sims, with daily silver meetings chaired by our superintendent team. To give you reassurance, there is daily data considered on absence levels, calls for service from the public, the number of incidents and the type of crimes reported, a daily watch on our response times, the intelligence briefings coming in, and the summaries of national, regional and local information, threats, etc., and of course that communication with the local resilience forums. To give reassurance that all departments in the Constabulary have business continuity plans in place. You'll be pleased to be reminded, I guess, that we did actually test these back in December as part of Brexit preparations, which now appear very useful, particularly in terms of the ability for staff to work in an agile manner, based remotely and at home, which tested the capacity of our Rome facility to allow that working to take place. Those tests were successful and gave early sight on issues faced with working remotely, licenses to do that, etc. I think that set us up to a really good foundation for this. Department heads had met in late March when they ran through contingency plans, particularly for those critical functions, and we took assessments of what impact would be taken on measures, just for example, staffing reductions of 20%, 30% or 50% due to the crisis. Measures were considered of how we track performance and what risks and interdependencies there with other departments. Further exercise was run on the 1st of April, which gave us the ability to ensure staff could be working from home. What quickly came from that is that was possible. The major challenge was those with equipment availability. And I'm pleased to report that since then, over 100 laptops have been issued to ensure that our teams can be working effectively from the home environment, which I believe that's very useful because it does allow those self-isolating, for instance, not to be just at home in the sense of a sickness absence, but actually to be working on a regular basis from home and keeping up their good work as police officers in staff. Moving on to the aspect of funding, this is brought up regularly on the weekly calls with commissioners and relevant ministers. We are hopeful of being reimbursed as part of a national system that should be nationally coordinated. I can confirm to you that Cheshire are operating at the moment, though, without any detailed guarantee from government, and that no additional funds have been awarded as of yet. Panel members, with their knowledge of policing finance, will recognise that this causes a real pressure on police finances, and you'll be rightly assured that the constabulary is recording all additional activity and costs relating to the pandemic. What kind of makes this a particular critical factor at the moment, though, is that there are a huge amount of extra costs being incurred, but on the other side, we're being asked to spend money in a quicker fashion. For instance, we're being asked to make payments to supplier faster from the government to support businesses to keep running. We've been asked to bring in special measures to support forensic providers on a national level. We've been asked to underwrite nationally procured PPE within our current existing budgets until matters are resolved. And for those of you more interested in the financial element, you will recognise that this puts enormous pressure on funds, but more pressure on the cash flow, because of course funding from government and via the council tax is only coming in periodically throughout the year rather than at the start of the financial year. I can envisage, following that theme, that without some fairly quick government support and action, and bearing in mind the cash flow situation, it's almost inevitable that this would lead to local borrowing to sustain policing throughout the short-term time within this crisis. Members will be aware that any borrowing does have additional costs of that borrowing, which will have a knock-on effect on local policing. In that theme, I'd support particularly the influence of the panel and the influence through Evan as Deputy Chair of your national organisation, with John on the line as well from the national panel, to give commissioners whatever support is necessary with that in conversations with government, because I will take any actions that are required, standing alongside the Chief Constable, to make sure funding is there to keep the people of Cheshire safe throughout this period. So I'd welcome any additional influence we can have in continuing to lobby the government to act. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Councillor Dawson, any supplementary?
Sure. I mean, obviously, there are lots of questions I'd like to ask in relation to all of that, but the one I'll focus in on is actually the budget situation, and in particular the use of reserves. I presume that you have started to dip into reserves to fund some of the current arrangements. Can you give us an indication of numbers in terms of just how much additional spending Cheshire Police has incurred during this crisis that you hadn't otherwise, or would have otherwise covered in general policing budgets?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. That's an issue that I'm discussing with the Chief Constable at the moment. Obviously, that there is a running bill that will be calculated by the constabulary, and I've asked that to kind of come to me on a monthly basis. So happy to update as relevant as that comes in my role of holding the constabulary to account in terms of being efficient and effective. I am already talking to my Chief Finance Officer and those in the constabulary through the Chief Constable about the impact on those reserves. As I've just mentioned there, the amount of pressures on us to, in my mind, inappropriately, to have to underwrite things locally, like PPE, which should be coordinated and is being coordinated nationally, like a number of national responsibilities, that is putting a great pressure on us. We do want to support paying local businesses and contractors out to be able to ensure their survival and their staff's survival. But just to reassure you, those reserves aren't sufficient to take us through the next few months on the basis of which money would normally be received. So I have already, as I indicated, started those conversations with finance professionals about if and when we will have to borrow. You know, just for instance, some of those calls from government are looking for forces to underwrite PPE by £5 million. That's bigger than my available usable reserves for the whole of the constabulary. So I have to be very clear in terms of spending public money in the right way. We're trying to make sure everyone's supported and things are flowing correctly, but there is a real ongoing conversation with ministers about what can happen locally at local budgets, what can happen nationally. I'm respectful that this is a developing picture, but I just did want to draw to your attention the reality that I am likely to have to agree further constabulary borrowing, which will come with costs. I recognise they're very low interest rates at the moment, which we should be grateful for that other side of the coin. But those low interest rates do make it possible for us to borrow, but we shouldn't be having to borrow money from financial institutions just to carry on the day-to-day elements of policing.
You're absolutely right. Thank you. I know there's a lot of, we could go on supplementary questions. There's some real hard issues here that need surfacing. But if I may move it on, Councillor Dawson, what I would reassure the Commissioner is John Gilly-Ross, the Chairman of the National Association, myself, have got a meeting on Monday with the National Chair of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners, and there are a number of major issues, and this is one that we will be raising to ensure that there's a cohesive approach between both national associations in bringing some weight to bear to address these not very successful ways of financially operating and the demands at a local level. So you have our reassurance on that one. Councillor Mick Warren, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioner. I'm going to look at question 8 around the level of absence from duty due to self-isolation, COVID itself. I'm particularly interested in what contingencies have been put in place to deal with any large number of officers who end up self-isolating at one of the larger stations, such as Warrington, Chester or Crewe. Because obviously we don't know where we are on the COVID infection curve at the moment. And our officers are obviously key frontline workers. Have we got the flexibility within the shift system to cope with this?
Thank you for your question, Councillor. It's a good question, which I'll give a brief response to, and obviously welcome any supplementary questions. I recognise that the Chief Constable has made plans to allow working to be as safe as possible. That has been achieved through a provision of PPE by good health advice and by planning the location of staff, and actually in many cases moving the location of staff to safeguard the safe continuance of those services. My latest figures from talking to the Chief Constable only this Wednesday suggest that 5.2% of our workforce were self-isolating or absent due to caring for dependents. But out of that 5.2%, actually 3.2% of those were still able to work from home. So in that situation, I'd advise in real terms, there's a 2% absence related to COVID-19 matters. I believe that is a really good assurance and compares very well nationally. And I think that's been achieved very well by the Chief Constable by putting in the measures that he has to ensure safe working, but also in making that maximum use of committed officers and staff that whilst they may be self-isolating due to underlying conditions or caring or self-isolating due to conditions of dependence, that vast majority of those in self-isolation are continuing to work to keep the majority of the people of Cheshire safe. So I hope that gives some real reassurance on that particular issue.
Councillor Warren, any supplementary? Any supplementary, Councillor Warren?
Sorry, Chair, I didn't come through. No, that's fine, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Councillor Bissett, can I ask you to give the question number and address your question to the Commissioner, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I will follow on from Councillor Warren and take question 9. Good afternoon, Commissioner. What is the overall current level of sickness in Cheshire Police?
Yes, thank you, Councillor, and I hope that members will appreciate this figure as I announce this. I talked to the Chief Constable on Wednesday, and you will be aware that the Chief Constable has worked very hard, as this is a major factor that both the panel and myself were very keen is addressed in terms of welfare of staff and in terms of effectiveness of the constabulary to serve the public. I'm pleased to announce that the Chief told me on Wednesday that the workforce absent through sickness is now as low as 2.9%.
Can I come in with a supplementary?
Of course you can, Councillor.
Right. Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Commissioner. Just following on from that, given this is a different situation, if you like, around COVID-19, etc., sickness and self-isolation, I would assume that Cheshire Police has back to work interviews, sickness interviews. Given the support some officers might need, has that changed in any way, or has there been an increased emphasis on back to work interviews from sickness of this that might be connected to the virus?
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, I have talked to the Chief Constable about our approach, and I must say it's a kind of much wider and much more fulfilling system than simply back to work in interviews. There's a whole host of support for well-being, for physical health, mental health, financial health within the current environment. I'm really proud of the positive and proactive way in which these services have been stepped up, and just to give you that real assurance, both from a HR and occupational health and from a local direct supervision lead, the response is one of real care, of real value and of real support. One of my early concerns with this, might surprise you, wasn't actually absenteeism. It was actually presenteeism, where the major risk for us was that because our officers and staff are so committed, that the risk was that they might come in and try to work through illnesses. That for me has been the major factor with the Chief Constable, to encourage people where they may be at risk, or they may be at a home at risk situation. We're all aware that anybody can be carrying coronavirus for many days without realising this. A real focus for me has been keeping the whole of the public safe, the workforce safe. So equal concerns and care on presenteeism as absenteeism. And I'm really assured, both by the Chief Constable, both by our weekly meetings with HR and the staff associations, the Police Federation for officers, the Unison Trade Union for police staff, and the Superintendents Association, that all of this is actually being really successfully managed. So all of that assurance from all of those bodies does give me real assurance that this is acting in the correct way for all involved. But very important question.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioner.
Thank you, Councillor Bissett. Just a point to make there, from the panel's point of view, we were very reassured last year to see the very robust process and presentation and professionalism of the Force's occupational health team, and extend our thanks to them, because I can see the work that they're doing in the challenging circumstances. Supporting the Force is of vital importance, and as you say, issues around mental health and financial strains is also equally a major issue that can impact on the workforce as well as COVID-19. Moving it on, Councillor Norman Plumpton-Walsh, could you take the question and give me the number?
Yes, Chairman, thank you very much. Hello, Commissioner, good afternoon on this sunny day. I have two questions for you, questions 13 and 14. Question 13, what measures have been implemented to ensure any disproportionate police activity is recorded and investigated? Obviously on the back of that figure that we had earlier of the 45 FPNs, which is obviously low in number. And then question 14, taking me back to my days of studying criminology. Given the historic tradition in the UK of policing by consent, can you confirm that there is a strategy to ensure community confidence in the police whilst they have these extraordinary powers at their disposal? And I would like to note here my appreciation, thanks and somewhat joy when I have a look at Facebook every day of Cheshire Police and the travels of PC Panda, particularly around Runcorn. I noticed a few smiles there, so I noticed that news is getting traction. He can often be spotted around Runcorn saying happy birthday to children, obviously in the distance, but obviously that ties in with our policing by consent model. So just those two, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and I note your studies of the past, which are similar to mine. I did read some of these questions, which almost appeared like some of our old essay questions for
yes,
work, but they're absolutely valid in practical terms. and of course they highlight the kind of important nature, one, of policing by consent, but two, checks and balances to make sure that that system can continue with confidence. So in terms of question 13, how disproportionate activity could be recorded and investigated, just again to give that reassurance that the full police complaint system, as we all know, has been enhanced over recent months with a new start in February of this year. That does continue as a statutory function, and you'll all be aware that that has been extended to not just complaints, but actually to consider any expression of dissatisfaction towards policing. And I think we're all aware that remains at the moment handled by the Constabulary's Professional Standards Department. To give you some reassurance in relation to COVID-19 incidents, these do continue to be handled in accordance with that statutory framework, and any complaints from members of the public are assessed, logged and recorded, and measures are put in place for those concerns to be resolved or investigated. As we know, following that, all recorded complaints, after we receive the outcome, a member of the public has a right of review if they're unhappy with the outcome. Due to the new legislation, that can either be to myself and the OPCC or to the IOPC. So as of the 22nd of March, just before the COVID legislation came in, I've been very keen to see that a separate log has been maintained by PSD. This is within, but distinct from the general work that's taken place, so that we can allow for any trends to be identified and to actually challenge or enhance that operational approach to policing. So I hope that gives you some reassurance of the measures about how activity can be recorded and investigated, and that there is a particular eye on complaints and dissatisfaction that comes in from the COVID legislation and actions that follow that. Moving on to question 14, I would add to this question really, because, you know, I respect and have an awful lot of scrutiny and challenge to ensure that Cheshire does stay within that community-based approach of engaging, explaining and encouraging compliance before moving to enforcement. And I think that that is the way to tackle this. Now, for me, when we talk about police having these extraordinary powers at the disposal, my view on that is that, you know, the government don't really, the police don't really have extraordinary powers at their disposal. I think the government have imposed extraordinary measures, which I believe are proportionate in the climate that we're in, but of course are extraordinary in terms of what we're used to and the general climate. The police powers to deal with these are actually quite limited. Whilst the police hold all the powers they've always had in terms of arrest, the actual powers in relation to breaches of the recent act regarding coronavirus is merely those powers of a fixed penalty notice, as discussed before. And those fines from fixed penalty notices are quite limited, don't come with a criminal record, and are summary only offences. What I would say, just to give you assurance beyond any of that, is of course police do retain their general powers of arrest that could come from any other offence, including issues like breach of the peace. So just to give reassurance that despite these extraordinary limitations on daily life, The powers are very minimal that exist to enforce that, and that's why this is being approached with the engage, explain and encourage elements before those minor powers are used. Having said that, I do note the general powers of arrest still exist, and I'm pleased, as I mentioned earlier, that Cheshire appeared to have acted proportionately on the whole, with only 45 enforcements by FPN delivered across over 1 million population over the last month or so. What I would add to this, following conversations with the Chief Constable, which actually followed some early questions to me from support from panel members, is that the Constabulary have gone out with a public survey that's been promoted, which is there essentially to test opinion on the police in response. Now, I recognise that this isn't perfect, and I probably expect a question from Sally later on with this, because I know she shares my views on the validity of statistics of surveys at times. But if I can just tell you that so far, over 2,000 responses have come in from the Cheshire public, of which almost 92% support the Cheshire approach. Obviously, that does leave just over 8% that don't support the Cheshire approach, but that could be split clearly into two sections, of those that don't believe we should be carrying out any action, and those that believe we should be carrying out much more action than Cheshire Constabulary is carrying out. So with the pinch of salt of which I take statistics, I do welcome the fact that the Constabulary agreed to do that survey and generally have a very, very supportive approach of the public so far. I'll leave it there and obviously await any supplementary questions, Councillor, but thank you for those important questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Do you have a supplementary, Councillor Hunter-Walsh?
No, I don't. I think that's been very comprehensively answered, and I obviously share that that scepticism of statistics. But yeah, that's for another day. Thank you again, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. What I would add to that, and you're absolutely right. Thus far, if you'd have told me 3 weeks ago that the public would have reacted in the way that they have, the level of compliance and self-discipline, by and large, that I've seen is extraordinary. And that can only be achieved by having implicit trust in politicians at a national and a local level and with the police. So it is working, but as we've said from the outset, we need to act, all of us, as a barometer to actually effectively oversee these most extraordinary of times. And full credit to the Cheshire community, Warrington, Halton, Cheshire East and Cheshire West, for the way in which they're responding in such a cohesive manner. So thank you. If I could move business on, can I just ask members, if at the end of the question they're satisfied with the Commissioner's response, but they also want a supplementary, could you just indicate by putting your hand up like that, and I'll come to you and it will just save a bit of time. Mr. Fusart, could I ask for your question and number, please?
And good afternoon, Commissioner. I'll do 2 questions in one, if I may. It's question 4 and question 12. Would you confirm that the effective use of body-worn video to monitor public and police behaviour in order to develop effective policing throughout this period is being implemented? Particularly, I'm thinking of this in light of the incident and embarrassment that Lancashire Police had to go through. And with regards to question 12, what steps have been put in place for the public to report and log what they feel to be disproportionate acts by the police, and how widely has this information been disseminated? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bob. And again, very, very important questions for the assurance of our public. If I can assure you through my conversations with the Chief Constable that body-worn video does continue to be used and is, in my mind, largely effective. Guidance has gone out that when officers are engaging regarding COVID-19 situations, and they consider a possibility of moving towards an enforcement scenario, that officers are being encouraged to utilise the body-worn video. In the situations where enforcement actually takes place, officers have been asked to activate body-worn video. This footage can then form part of the review of enforcement activity that is taken, and can allow the constabulary to ensure scrutiny internally in relation to the policing style, and for my office to give further scrutiny to that. Officers do continue to use their body-worn video, of course, when attending all usual events to capture evidence, particularly used well at the moment with domestic abuse reports, particularly where prosecutions very often now are evidence-led rather than or as well as witness-led. So just to give that example, and the scenarios in which officers are being encouraged to use that means of evidence gathering. The second question, was it question 12, Bob?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. So the steps that are put into place for the public to report and log what they feel to be disproportionate acts by the police. I think it's really important that the public have that right of challenge and that right of feedback, which I think you and I and panel members regard as absolutely essential. What I would say with that one is that the usual methods do exist for members of the public to either make a complaint, or even if they don't want to feel that it's as serious as a complaint, to express their dissatisfaction with any element of policing. Both of those measures do now get considered in the same way. That can be done directly with policing through ringing on the non-emergency number on 101. But I do recognise that many residents now do like to take advantage where they can of the online system, which does give direct access to lodge an expression of dissatisfaction. It has a direct link with the Professional Standards Department, which is monitored on a daily basis. And whilst I would encourage people to use that if they do have any expression of dissatisfaction to enable us to have a good view on this, I would also put in equal measure of the amount of good messages, the amount of messages of support for police action, the amount of encouragement of police action, the amount of thank yous that have come in, both publicly and privately. I think the panel have probably seen a number of those, and no doubt some of those have been in contact with the panel as well. So whilst it is really important to have scrutiny, it's also really important to point out good practice and to celebrate some excellent work that goes on within policing in current times.
Mr. Fuso, your supplementary, please.
Yeah, the last part of that question, Commissioner, was how widely has this information been disseminated? Because most people within Cheshire do not come into contact with or have any dealings with the police. Now we're in an environment where that may increase, or that the eventuality may increase, and therefore they need some guidance, I suppose, with regards to how they could bring in any complaints, not necessarily complaints, but any comments they have with regards to the way the policing is being carried out.
Yes, thank you, Bob. I think I missed that part because it wasn't on the question put, but I do recognise you've asked that. As I said, I think that remains a situation where people are becoming very aware of the ability to lodge complaints and expressions of dissatisfaction against public services. Those items will always be mentioned if those in those situations want to make a complaint. Information should always be furnished about how that complaint could be made. I do want to know that happens, to be able to watch the general patterns if they're emerging, and it also allows us to, within systems, to put behaviours right at an early stage before they potentially set in. What I would say is that through the level of contact that I receive and the constabulary receive, I do believe people are very able to make those expressions of dissatisfaction known. And I think it's also becoming more popular as well for people to make their expressions of satisfaction known, although we don't have as formal a process for that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Fusar. Just a point I think you should make there. There's several journalists on this meeting, obviously muted, listening in. The role the media is playing, and a very responsible role, both in equal balance, highlighting what is very good about the policing, the public response, and also highlighting, you know, albeit in the minority, some bad and unacceptable behaviour. But the media too do have a very, very important role, even in oversight of this panel, for instance, in terms of how effectively it's operating in, as we all call it, these extraordinary times. If I could move it on to Mrs. Hardwick. I know you've been looking forward to this, Commissioner.
Yes.
I've got several issues, but I realise we're a bit stretched for time. So first of all, you thanked Martin and Cheshire and Andrew. I'd like to thank you for what you did to clear the way for this to be held. However, before the present outbreak, Cheshire resources, police resources, were strapped, as were all resources in the country. And we were told of an exercise to recruit several officers into the police force to make up the shortfall. Where has this disappeared to? What is happening on recruitment?
Yes, thank you, Sally, and thank you for your kind comments, and really good to see that you're safe and well. Yes, recruitment is ongoing. Those projected numbers that you kindly supported in the precepts and the budget presentations that I made to you do continue. Those processes are still being followed by our HR functions. I am in touch again on a weekly basis to receive updates from the Chief Constable on that matter. So I recognise that news nationally may have gone quiet on recruitment, but on a Cheshire basis, recruitment, I can assure you, does continue. All of these matters has received that attention in continuity planning, and I'm pleased to say that that very much continues.
How many have we got lined up, and what effect is this going to have on the budget? Because apparently we're not being recompensed for it until afterwards.
Yeah, it's that ongoing situation, Sally, and it really hasn't changed since we talked at the end of January, informally and then formally at the briefing. These officers are to be, the extra officers are to be delivered between April, of which we're in now, and next April. There is a commitment to deliver those. They are delivered in terms of being appointed to be in police constables at varying stages throughout this year. I think we also have to bear in mind, though, that the arrival and the appointment of a police constable doesn't make them trained, doesn't make them competent to be out on their own performing police tasks. And that whole procedure of training people, going through the various physical tests, through the various vetting procedures and all the training to allow them to be independent and competent officers, really does take an amount of time that goes way beyond this year. If you're asking me, do I believe that we have the capacity to successfully recruit those officer numbers within this financial year, I can give you the assurance that the Chief Constable has given me that that is still the plan and that we fully intend to. So there is no real change. The only real change, Sally, is, as I mentioned on Councillor Dawson's question, with regard to how fast the money comes in to allow us to have the cash flow to fund our daily public service, is a huge effort for us, which remains unresourced and unanswered by government. And that's why I, unfortunately, at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, have started the conversations about borrowing money to get us over this period, because it is beyond our reserves that have been drastically diminished over the last few years. Those reserves don't cover the amount we need to keep going. So I will have to borrow. Whether that money then will be repaid by government remains to be seen, because genuinely there is no confirmation on that as of yet. But I do recognise the huge amount of national work and that national effort that's going into prioritising this response.
Okay, Sally, I do need to move it on. We've got about 4 minutes left.
I'm sorry. I'm just wondering how on earth, in the days of social distancing, we're managing to conduct interviews and things like that. But never.
Yeah,
I'll ask that separately.
Thank you. We have got, the Commissioner has booked more frequent meetings with us, and there's a number of issues. Recruitment is certainly one of them. I'm right in thinking you've got 3 minutes left, Commissioner, because you've got another meeting. Is that right?
Unfortunately so, Chairman.
Yeah, so I'll just move on to the final question, and I'd just like a couple of minutes to sum it up after Councillor Finlow's question. Councillor Finlow, please.
Earlier statements when it was you were referring to engaging and explaining to the public and the extraordinary powers which have been given to the police. I was wondering, albeit that it's within a summary jurisdiction, as the Commissioner has pointed out, with fixed penalty notices, but I was wondering specifically about the necessary training to ensure consistency of practice in exercising these new and extraordinary powers. Now, I realise there are difficulty in ordinary classroom situations because of the emergency, but whether it's distance learning or otherwise, working through case studies, there does need to be a comprehensive programme of training to ensure that any consistency in applying these extraordinary powers is secured. Has the Commissioner any information on that?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. I'm just recognising that that's not the final question we're referring to, but a very valid question, and to give the reassurance that the Chief Constable has given to me, yes, there has been extensive training. Yes, there has been a briefing note in a handbook form supplied on these issues. And yes, there is a specialist team that, whilst this enforcement is taking place, can give advice. Advice can be sought on proportionality in giving out these the very final stage of enforcement with these fines. I find that to be completely a good way of working. And obviously, I've already explained the post FPN phase of how these are assessed and latterly considered for consistency by the Operation Pandas team.
Thank you.
Supplementary.
Well, could I also ask about what percentage of complaints, we've spoken about complaints post-lockdown, are referable to alleged overzealous approach to enforcement? Have the figures been distorted compared with the normal level of complaints by complaints in this area, or not?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and it's kind of slightly, as Councillor Finlow will will expect is slightly skewed by the new complaint system in terms of comparing complaints of the past to the current. So I think we all
Yes.
recognise the new system treats any expression of dissatisfaction as a complaint, whereas the previous system was much more formal in terms of this is a complaint that we wish to make, rather than just any dissatisfaction that's expressed. So if I was to look, for instance, at my data provided by the constabulary for my information, and it does go from the new system at the 1st of February, which of course this current scenario didn't come into place till perhaps mid-March. So until this week in that period, we'd had 46 complaints logged, which related to COVID-19 incidents or issues. The majority of these matters related to 3 general areas. One was that concerns were that police officers were not adhering to social distancing themselves, or people's perceptions that appropriate PPE was not being used in appropriate situations. I would say lots of these were public perceptions and have been seen on social media, etc., where people felt that people were perhaps within that 2-metre boundary. Another area would be the use of social media to engage with the public and let them know the response to COVID-19. I think we all know several of those issues have been in local and national media, but individual public complaints came in about some of those. The direct area of complaints have come in from police officers making legitimate inquiries at households, and some of those concerns being raised because the occupants were self-isolating and were worried about the prospect of police officers at the door or in the house in terms of social isolation. Out of the 46, 7 of the expressions of dissatisfaction did relate to members of the public expressing concern that they'd been challenged about being questioned about a journey they were on at the time they were stopped or questioned. Again, I must say, to go alongside that, I've received an awful lot of good feedback from the public, and particularly key workers who have been reassured to be stopped, and the efficiency and the effectiveness and the friendliness of which that has taken place. I would also congratulate the constabulary about the increased amount of criminals that have been stopped, arrested and charged following these stops that have taken place. So I think there's very much 2 lines to this. In summary, one, that we do welcome any expression of dissatisfaction, and I've noted that a lot of that has come from media or social media reports that people have responded to. The other main areas resulted from legitimate activity of either stopping vehicles or visiting households where people were kind of worried about intentions or worried about the potential of transmission of COVID-19. So I hope that gives some reassurance again in terms of relatively low numbers of complaints over that period, which do take into account a much wider feeling of dissatisfaction rather than just formal complaints.
Thank you.
Any supplementary? I mean, I've said very comprehensive response, and thank you for furnishing that level of detail. Okay, it's down to me to just summarise it and let the Commissioner move on to his meeting. Can I make a suggestion that if the members agree, once the Commissioner has left the meeting, are we happy that there are some journalists in on the call to unmute them and take any questions as a panel with regard to this recent meeting? Yeah, we're happy to do that. Okay. So in summarising, remember we are in sad and dark times, and people across all of the, excuse me, we didn't put that in the protocol, mute your home phone. We are in sad times, and our thanks to all of the emergency services. The Fire and Rescue Service are doing some quite extraordinary work, well beyond their statute in supporting vulnerable people, and especially vulnerable young people through the Prince's Trust as well, let's not forget that. And the ambulance service. Overall, the cohesiveness of the Operation Emergency Services is exemplary. And when this is over, we must not lose that symbiosis between those services and further integration and cohesion. And I say that especially the NHS, because I've long felt the NHS is an absolute integral party to effective community cohesion, resilience and risk reduction. And we must not lose those relationships and bond that has been formed through protecting the NHS. I know Laura had another question. She has an interest. You will get a chance later on at a further meeting to pursue the support for those suffering from domestic abuse. Can I thank the panel? I'm very gifted to have the level of background of people on the panel that we have, especially the experience in law, ex-police officer and ex-director from the Home Office. It is a very skillful panel, and I never take that for granted. The support of the officers has been exemplary. One of our members has to leave this meeting to go to a family member's funeral who sadly died of COVID-19. So let's not forget the real human cost of this. And finally, in these dark days, and to finish on a high point, I'd like to extend the panel's congratulations to Deputy Chief Constable Julie Cook, who became a grandmother yesterday. Thank you very much. Commissioner, thank you for a very professional response, and we'll allow you to leave us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, panel.
Could we unmute those people? And I'm happy with the Louise Austin from the Chief Staff Officer, anyone who's in on the call who has a question or an issue to raise with regard to how we organise this meeting. You know, it was a bit lumpy, but by and large, I'm proud of the way people responded. Can we unmute the journalists, Andrew?
I've unmuted most people. The ones I put back on mute is where there appears to be background noise, which interrupts us, but most people are unmuted if they wish to say something.
Tina, I noticed David's dropped out. No, it's here. Sorry, Tina first.
Can I first of all ask a general question as regards to how successful you feel the meeting has been in terms of being able to scrutinise the PCC and how that would compare to a normal meeting?
I can do more meetings soon, actually. I think it's extraordinary. You know, it's not easy. I came into this very nervous. I know people were nervous, but by and large, we're making it up as we go along, but we have rehearsed about 3 or 4 times before. And if any other panels, I know they are on, or we could extend it, is invest that time in rehearsing, and it is worth it, because otherwise you don't have rules of engagement between the members and a close working relationship with the Commissioner. You know, I can understand how people will be quite nervous of meeting, but today, my view has gone well. I don't know if any other members got a comment on that. Just put your hand up, please.
Hello. I think it went very well. I mean, I'm quite new to Zoom, and I think it went very well. And I'm very, very grateful to everybody who's helped me. I think that we asked maybe too many questions, because I've made a note of things we didn't ask. We didn't ask about child abuse. We didn't ask about the National Crime Agency and their reports. I'm particularly interested in things like response times. I mean, the stats are fine. Well, everybody knows my feeling about stats, but I am concerned that the low numbers relate basically to people who have back office routines. And therefore, I am still terribly interested in how he's going to go about the recruitment exercise on when we're socially isolating. I'll be asking that. And also, on the National Crime Agency, I've been listening to reports which actually say that although non-COVID related crime has gone down, we are seeing an increase in things like ASBOs and on things like my particular interest is email crime, where you know, I mean, I've been the victim myself, lucky enough I spotted it and I passed it on to the fraud office, but it's endemic, it really is. And I would like to have some reassurance that this has been recognised and appropriate resources deployed, and where from.
Thanks, Sally. I mean,
We've got Dave Thompson and Norman also wants to talk, Adam.
Thank you.
Yeah. I had, sorry.
No, you go first.
Are you sure? Sorry, there's a bit of a crosswire there. I had question 18 flagged as well, but I think, yeah, like it was quite a few questions. The only thing for me was that we couldn't actually physically see the crime commissioner to have a look at his body language, facial expressions, etc. I think for me, the whole human element is what this is all about. That you can only see half my face then, but never mind, it's probably an improvement. But yeah, on that point, it would have been better to have actually physically seen him. Because none of us have been able to see him. So in that sense, maybe try and make sure he's on board with this, if we have more meetings like this in future.
We've got Dave and me in terms of wanting to speak, Evan.
Yeah, just on Councillor Plumpton-Walsh's point there, I think 90% of communication is body language. I think you raise a very important issue. I'll go to Councillor Thompson and come to Councillor Dawson. Councillor Thompson.
Yeah, well, I wanted to interject just to say, because I'm that one person, I've got to get to Frodsham now to a funeral, so I'm going to need to go. But the meeting began with the chair giving a lot of thanks to different people, which was quite due and appropriate. But I have to say, and having had so many regular conversations with him recently, I have to say to all of you, Evan has done an absolutely fantastic job recently. And he's very humble about the praise that he should have. He really has, in the conversations I've had with him, it's become very evident. He's really picked up on some of the key issues of the legislation and the panel not meeting and making sure that this meeting happens. So I think we should all just say thank you to Evan. I found the meeting very helpful. I could get used to this. Let's not meet again in future. Let's just do this. But I thought it was useful, and I think it was very important what we did. I came to this meeting with real concerns that Cheshire may be one of those forces, a bit like the publicity Derbyshire have had. It may have been a force that's been overzealous in terms of going out there and just looking for people to issue penalties to. It isn't. And in the time we had the meeting, I actually looked at the statistics 2 weeks ago of the MPCC, and Cheshire was, I think it's the 4th or 5th lowest in the country for issuing fines. So that was interesting to see. And if we've still got people online from Lancashire, interestingly, the figures a couple of weeks ago showed Lancashire was the worst place in the country for being issued, most likely to be issued with a £60 fine. So I was quite reassured with a lot of the things he had to say. I think there's lots of things there we need to come back to, and I would finally say it might be worthwhile in 2 or 3 weeks' time if we were to meet again. I don't want to put a lot of pressure on our officers in Cheshire East that support us, but there were some key issues there, one of which was the issue of the borrowing and the finance and the recruitment and some of the things that Sally has just mentioned. So I kind of felt this has been incredibly helpful, but in some respects it's been half a meeting. and we probably need to have a subsequent meeting. But for now, I'm going to have to say goodbye to you all, okay?
Thanks for your comments, Dave. Much appreciated. I've got Andrew Dawson, and I'm coming back to Martin. And I am conscious Martin is one agenda item.
I'm leaving now. Bye-bye.
From my point of view, technically the meeting went as well as I could have expected it. From my point of view, without being rude to anybody at all, it was somewhat disappointing we had so many people joining by phone. I only wish some of them had actually tried earlier and rehearsed and made sure that the systems would work, rather than trying to dial in moments before the meeting and hoping that everything was going to work. We as a panel deliberately set up rehearsals to make sure that it would work. Perhaps that's an element of learning that needs to be carried forward. And I agree that it would have been helpful if we'd seen the Commissioner, because it would have been easier to interject and to ask supplementary questions, because when he was on the phone, it wasn't actually easy or appropriate to interrupt him. But I think for us, yes, as Dave said, it's half a meeting. There's much more we really need to dig in on. We were only scratching the surface as far as I was concerned, but my God, at least we started, we've tried. And I think the way we get around this is to have a relatively frequent series of meetings, particularly when we're locked down, so that we can ask the detailed questions. I mean, for example, on the budget matters, I'd have liked to have heard some figures rather than some generalities, so that we actually know where he stands vis-a-vis the budgets and the reserves and so on and so forth. And certainly if we get a second chance, I want to drill into these figures and I actually want to hear some.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Dawson. If you had something to say, and just before you do, the item 5 on the agenda, which needs to review the need for further meetings during the coronavirus emergency, which picks up nicely on the issue that Andrew has just made. Can you just tell us what the Commissioner has agreed to? I think we've scheduled a number of dates, haven't we?
I mean, is that for me?
Yeah, for you, Martin. Yeah.
Sorry, the sound broke up a little bit. The panel has been offered some informal meeting dates with the Commissioner, which I think certainly the first of those was, I think, for early May, which would have to be done virtually. I think the basis of those meetings were the regular informal meetings which the panel have held at police headquarters, where, if you remember, the convention is that the Commissioner sets the agenda for those meetings, or he suggests areas of study. I think in terms of item 5 of this agenda, I think the item was there to ask members if you felt there was a need, a desire, an urgency to have this sort of meeting again, where there was wider public access and access by journalists. Because obviously if we have an informal meeting with the Commissioner on the basis of the normal meetings, they are private meetings with no formal meeting.
Yeah, on that, I think from what I've heard, I'll take questioning. There is a mandate for you to consult with the Commissioner's office and organise more frequent meetings, especially throughout this period. Are we all in general agreement on that?
I mean, Chairman, it could very well be that the most obvious date for the first of those meetings is the date that the Commissioner has indicated is available. I haven't got the notes in front of me, but I can circulate that to panel members.
I was seeing the dates, and I think you're absolutely spot on. We go for that, and we'll build on the experience of today. Just conscious, Dave Holmes is with us. Have you got any questions, Dave? Because I know you're sort of pan Cheshire. It'd be useful to get your reflection on it.
Yeah, well, the sound quality generally was pretty good, which is the key thing. Because I did listen in on a Crown Court hearing the other week, and I really struggled to hear the prosecutor. So, yeah, the audio quality is key. I did want to ask, actually, is there any problem? I did take a screenshot while the meeting was in session. Am I allowed to use that? I wanted to be able to illustrate the fact that it's a virtual meeting, not a normal meeting.
It's interesting because I noticed Tina did as well. We could all grace the pages of policing insight, heaven forbid, as several of us have already. I took one as well, which I was going to tweet, and I'm glad you raised the question. We've got Brian with us. What's the legal view, Brian?
I think, Chair, it's largely a matter for the panel. And I say that because, of course, this body is not a Cheshire East body as such. It's hosted by Cheshire East Council. And of course, there's the issue, Chair, of the meeting being an informal meeting today. So it has a different status, in my view, than one which might be a formal decision-making meeting. So my advice to the panel would be to form a view now as to whether or not the panel members are content that this material be tweeted or reproduced in some way for the public to see. The panel may consider that it's actually a very positive message to come from Cheshire Police Areas Police and Crime panel. I don't think there's anything which prohibits it, certainly, Chair.
Thank you, Brian. Councillor Dawson.
Don't forget, we are recording this meeting, and the intention is to share the recording with Cheshire East so that it can go on the website. So from my point of view, for all our imperfections, I'm more than happy for the press to use an image of us meeting.
Okay, I've got Councillor Delaney, then Councillor Plumpton-Walsh. Councillor Delaney.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I mean, there might be, after some unkind comments by Councillor Dawson when we were on a one-to-one before, on my appearance, there might need to be some sort of digital enhancement in my case, but generally I'm quite happy to
go Councillor Dawson. Thank you, Councillor Delaney.
Norman wants to speak.
Yeah, I was going to say I was actually quite cheeky myself and took a screenshot of all us having a meeting, but obviously is what's been arisen now. It's recorded. It's in the public domain anyway. I don't have a problem with sharing it. Do you have a problem with me sharing it?
No.
As well?
Perhaps the best way to handle it, if anyone objects, put your hand up.
If you object, put your hand up. Yeah. Basically, and those I can't see. Is there any I can't see you object?
No, well, I can see everyone. I've got a big screen. And,
okay, brilliant.
Hey,
thank you.
Tina, happy with that. Tina, have you got any further questions?
Just one more. It's to do with the funding, actually. My understanding is that the PCC requested support from you as he goes forward and attempts to solve the funding issue. First of all, can I ask you, is that appropriate as a scrutiny body to offer the PC that level of sort of lobbying support? And secondly, if it is, what will the next steps be?
I mean, thank you, Tina. I'll bring you in a minute. It's not unusual for the chair of the panel, and indeed I've done it, to write to the Home Secretary, challenging some issues, and acting in support of the Commissioner where he highlights an issue. We're there also to ask the awkward questions, to add value to that. So, I mean, I don't know whether any other members of the panel have got a view on that, but I think we should play a prominent role. And one of the things I was going to do after this meeting is ask the Secretariat to liaise with the Commissioner's office to get some figures that we can put to the Home Secretary. And I'm especially wanting to know more about this rapid payments for PPE, etc. And I also would like to ask the Commissioner around the procurement process that's going on at the moment as well. But to stick to the point, we feel it's absolutely legitimate to engage with the Home Office on issues. John Gilly-Ross, you've got a question?
I have, and thank you for that. I'd like to start really by saying a big thank you and congratulations to Cheshire Panel. It's been extremely useful. And I'd like to say congratulations because as far as I can see, you're the first panel in the country that's held a meeting remotely like this. Very, very useful. I thought the way you handled it was excellent. Obviously, the questions were very, very good. and you'd taken the input from that from elsewhere. But to me, the whole thing reinforced the value of panels and how they challenge and support the Commissioner in their activities. And in challenging the Commissioner, of course, they form part of the policing family itself. It shows to me also that panels can add value without excessive powers. Sometimes that's being sought. I'm not really convinced myself. But yet in doing so, it demonstrates that quality and trusting partnership working is the way really to go forward. And is what is key to the public. So again, thanks for doing that. Congratulations for doing it. And certainly some of the activities that have come up today, the National Association will put out to all its membership, and particularly we'll take it forward in terms of how we tackle the really important aspects like the rapid payments that Evan just referred to, how we can promote that right the way through. Thanks for that. Really enjoyed the meeting, very professionally put together, and just shows that technology can really help. All we've got to do is be familiar with it. Thank you again.
Okay, I'm conscious we could go on and on. Could you just indicate if there's any questions or points you would wish to make, or learning from today's meeting that we need to think about, which will help all the officers as we go forward. Councillor.
Just to say, Evan, I've got to go in 2 minutes. I've got another meeting at 1:30. But I thought it was a very good meeting. And if the Commissioner continues to struggle to access the meeting, maybe we could donate him a phone that he could download Zoom onto.
I'm sure we can find a tablet or something and online instruction. Councillor Finlow, did I see you, or?
I'm going to have to go as well.
I was just going to say the way. Sorry, is it me?
Yes, Councillor.
I was just going to say the way in which the questions were printed and structured had a significant advantage in providing structure, but on the other hand, it precludes or tends to preclude spontaneity. And I do think if we have subsequent meetings like this, which obviously we're going to, we need some sort of structuring, preferably through a report with necessary facts and figures in, which will give us a foundation to post further questions to go into more detail if we have some sort of structured reporting. Thank you.
Yeah, just kind of, I know Sally picked up on that. There are questions we didn't get to, but I think we got through an incredible amount of business. And given it's our first remote meeting, yeah, it wasn't perfect, but you know, everyone should give themselves a bit of a pat on the back for the way we've done it.
I'm going to have to leave, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to have to leave. Yeah, I start back at work at 2.
Okay, before we bring it to a close, any other questions, any other points you would wish to make? No, Martin? No. Councillor Delaney, Mr. Smith, Martin, anything?
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Judah? No, okay. Councillor Dawson?
No, all fine by me. Obviously, if we're going to have another meeting, whatever platform, if you need my help, let me know and I'll happily facilitate.
All right, excellent, thank you. Councillor Bissett?
Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you. David?
Thank you.
David Holmes?
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant David. No, that's fine. I have nothing more to say. No, I thought it was really good, actually.
I'm very grateful for you coming in on the meeting, David. I'm sure it'll be fairly reported. You always do.
As always.
And you're very welcome to any other meeting. Sally Hardwick, anything to add?
Sorry?
Have you got anything?
No, nothing from me. I thought it was really good. There were some issues we didn't cover, but we didn't really have enough time to, and it was a very, very packed agenda.
It was indeed. You can let the dog back in now, Sally.
Can I? Are you sure?
Yeah. Councillor Finlow, yeah, anything final to add? No, I think he's frozen on us. John, anything final?
No, just thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you. Tina?
No, nothing from me, but thank you very much for inviting me this morning. I've really enjoyed it, found it really interesting. Thank you, Evan.
Okay, I look forward to the coverage. Brian, anything from your point of view?
I think, Chair, this is just illustrating with the help that we've seen today from Councillor Dawson, yourself and Martin, just how well a meeting like this can work. We're certainly committed to making use of all facilities, technological and otherwise, to ensure that we can have productive meetings again, even when we're making formal decisions, Chair. But other than that, I think it went really well.
Thank you, and thank you for all your support, Brian. Sergeant Louise Austin from the Chief Constable Staff Office is still in. Any observations from you, Louise?
No, nothing further from me. Thank you very much for letting me take part, though.
No problem at all. You're very welcome in the future, and I know you're going to give the Chief Constable an excellent and positive briefing on today's events.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Matt Walton from the Commissioner's Office. Matt, people don't know, I think, about the amount of work that you put into that today. I certainly don't underestimate it. And, you know, thank you for the responses to those questions that the Commissioner put across very concisely. Any learning from you or comments you'd wish to make, Matt?
Thank you, Evan. No, nothing from me, thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for all the learning, and I guess we're just at the beginning of what is going to be a very interesting process. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I'll end the meeting at this point. Cheers then.
Thank you.